Welcome to State of Mind, being human and living well.
And living well.
And living well.
And living well.
I'm the producer and host, Deborah Sloss, licensed marriage and family therapist, and my pronouns are she, her. For today's show, we've decided to focus on a serious mental health condition that, if not treated and well managed, can be dangerous and cause great disruption in a young adult's life. Bipolar disorder, or what used to be called manic depression, is a mental health condition causing extreme mood swings that includes emotional highs and depressive lows. And today we'll be discussing managing bipolar disorder while in college. Attending college can be a stressful time for all young adults. In addition to coping with academic pressures and trying to determine a career path, many students are dealing with separation from their families while also taking on more adult responsibilities like laundry, food shopping, cooking, and money management. And some students are additionally working jobs and taking care of family responsibilities. Most mental health disorders have peak onset during young adulthood, and by the age of 25, 75% of those who will have a mental health disorder have had their first episode. So while in college and meeting these many new stressors, many young adults will experience the first onset of mental health and substance use problems or an exacerbation of their symptoms. Also, a survey conducted by the National Alliance on Mental Illness showed a strong correlation between the number of college students who drop out and depression. 2/3 of college students in the U.S. who quit their studies did so because of mental disorders, and the same study revealed that 50% of those who dropped out didn't access mental health services. This information suggests that many students are going undiagnosed and are not getting the mental health treatment and the support services that they would need to be successful in college. We hope that today's show will help listeners learn more about bipolar disorder and the kind of care and attention it requires to manage. And we want you to know that students with bipolar disorder can implement effective treatments and seek support in order to make progress in their college education. For this conversation, we're joined by a recent college graduate who navigated and managed bipolar disorder throughout her college and graduate school years. We're also joined by a university psychiatrist with many years of experience working with and treating college students. Let me tell you more about these guests. Allyson Makuch is a recent graduate of UCSC, where she earned her master's in environmental studies. She was diagnosed with bipolar I disorder at the age of 14 and has been actively managing her illness since then. Navigating high school, college, and graduate school as a person with bipolar disorder and PTSD, as well as working as a teaching assistant to students with mental illness, illuminated the unique challenges that students living with mental illnesses face. Dr. Shuyun David Lowe is a board-certified psychiatrist who's worked in college mental health centers for more than 15 years. He attended medical school in Chicago and trained in psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco. He now serves as Director of Psychiatry at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Prior to his career in college and mental health, he worked in county mental health systems. As a college psychiatrist, he often encounters young adults who experience bipolar disorder for the first time in their lives. David treats students with a holistic attitude and considers medications, psychotherapy, and exercise as all part of the treatment. So welcome, Allyson and Dr. Lowe, to State of Mind. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So to get started, I'm thinking we'll start with you, Dr. Lowe. And I'm wondering if you can explain what bipolar disorder is and how it impacts those with the diagnosis.
Sure. So bipolar disorder is a mood disorder, and luckily it's a uncommon one. It's important to note that it's a mood disorder and not a psychotic disorder, not a personality disorder, because there's overlap with all those other disorders, and we'll get into that during the show. But bipolar mood disorder is defined by having one episode of mania in your life. More commonly, you have depression in your life. So, it used to be called manic depression. You know, if I stay with that nomenclature, I would say depression is the big D and mania is under a small m, because you don't need to have mania all the time to have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. So even though it's quantified as having two poles, or two kinds of disorders, depression is a much more common one, and you just need one episode of mania to give you that diagnosis. And mania versus hypomania is characterized by at least a week's worth of pretty severe symptoms that affects your social and occupational functioning. Essentially, you can't work or interact in your usual ways when you're under manic symptoms. So lack of sleep, talking fast, thinking fast, not acting like yourself. I mean, that's my quick and dirty way of talking about it to students. People under a manic episode will sleep very little and not feel tired. So that's a big difference. There's plenty of people that don't sleep, but they get tired as a result.
So, Dr. Lowe, you're talking about that bipolar disorders occur on a whole spectrum, and there's a range of severity. And at one end, you have the more severe versions that involve mania, but at the other end, you have something called cyclothymia.
Right. So cyclothymia, I mean, there's controversy about whether this is this should be used or not. Whether it's a useful diagnosis. I think it is. I mean, I think, cyclothymia, again, your social and occupational function would not be affected, and it wouldn't even last as long as or intensely as mania or hypomania. So probably somebody who's cyclothymic probably has more personality traits that are involved in their presentation versus a genetic biological disorder. Bipolar disorder, along with schizophrenia, those two come to mind right away, are what we think of as the most genetic and biological disorders. Most every other disorder that we identify have a huge range of psychosocial causes. So yeah, if we think about bipolar on the spectrum, cyclothymia is the mildest. Sometimes we throw in, so bipolar 1 is with mania, bipolar 2 is with hypomania. Bipolar 3, sometimes we use that, which is not official, but bipolar 3 is when people get mania or hypomania only when they're induced, by a drug or a medication. For me, I don't use cyclothymia very often because, especially in my population, the college age population, I'm thinking about what psychosocial factors, what personality factors could be contributing to their behavior that looks like bipolar disorder.
So, why do you think it's important to discuss this topic specifically with regard to college students?
So, bipolar disorder, when it first manifests, for most people, typically manifests in somebody's, late teens, early 20s. So that's your typical undergraduate college population. So that's why, when we see students and we're considering depression, and depression is much just straight depression, no bipolar disorder. That's obviously much more common, than bipolar disorder. We are very worried about the possibility of this emerging, and we ask questions and we screen people, for the possibility as much as we can, to predict whether bipolar disorder will emerge or not. But because this is the population that it will emerge in, so why do we care so much about it? It's horrifically, well, it can be really scary. It can be really risky. It's really scary to the person experiencing it for the first time, scary to those around them, the rest of the college community. And it can also be extremely dangerous. Your judgment is essentially impaired in a manic or a hypomanic state. And then, not to mention the depressive state. Well, of course, we understand the risk of depression, which involves suicide. But under a manic or hypomanic state, people are not making good decisions. And in a college environment, there's lots of ways to get yourself seriously traumatized and hurt in that manner.
So, what are some of the ways that people commonly end up getting diagnosed with this disorder?
So I think people get diagnosed through us a couple different ways. You only get diagnosed with bipolar disorder if you are in a manic or hypomanic state. And usually it's roommates or professors that bring this to our attention, and or just bring the student in. We get calls every week Not so much in the summer, but definitely in the fall, of concerned members of the college community that are worried about why this person is acting really differently. So they'll get brought in, and what we'll assess for then is how different this is from their past presentation. Now, I've seen bipolar disorder enough that I usually have a gut feeling. I have a sense that this is different, even though I can't compare it because I don't know their previous function. But the way they're dressed, they're talking, or the way that they're interacting, how quickly they're responding, that all gives me clues to their diagnosis. And I'll share that openly with them that I'm worried about this, based on your dress, based on how fast you're talking, based on how sometimes the interaction can be quite inappropriate. That often gives us a clue as to something more serious like bipolar disorder versus other reasons. The other reasons for this kind of behavior would be most commonly, drug abuse. Somebody's on a stimulant, methamphetamine, cocaine, it looks a lot like this as well. But then that wanes with time pretty quickly as soon as you're off the drug.
Can you just describe some of the other issues or problems that can present and look similar to bipolar disorder? And how do you go about sorting those things out?
Sure. This is actually one of my favorite topics to talk about because it comes up so often. I think in my career in psychiatry, which is something like 25 years now, you see waves of. I mean, there are certain diagnoses that are very popular during these waves. When I first started, it was repressed memories. Then adult ADHD was really popular. And bipolar disorder as of late has gotten. I've seen a surge of it. I would say in the past 5-10 years, mostly inappropriately diagnosed high school kids coming in without that first episode of mania get diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And I asked, how did you get diagnosed with that if you didn't have that episode? Because I think there's a lot of, among my peers, there's a lot of misconceptions and failures to diagnose accurately. People often will equate mood swings with bipolar disorder. People will miss by borderline personality traits or PTSD symptoms, post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, and confuse that with what could look like a manic state. You can have all kinds of disruptive, intense behaviors, but if it only lasts one day, that does not qualify you for hypomania or mania. You could go without sleep and talk fast and think fast and be really energized because of other reasons too. You're entitled to be human. We're all entitled to be human. We're all entitled to be distressed and be really charged about something. That shouldn't give you the diagnosis of bipolar disorder, is my point. Unfortunately, I see, I think it's easy to jump to that, and I think our healthcare system is so diagnostic and medication focused, even at a young age, that some of these labels get slapped on to young people, high school students, when it's really not warranted. So I think borderline personality traits, and I don't even use the word, you can notice I'm not using the word disorder, because I think the college age undergraduate population is too young to be diagnosed with a personality disorder. Sure, people come in with personality traits usually because of past trauma, and that has that mood lability. So mood lability is defined by, I think that's what people mean by mood swings. You can be laughing one second and then be crying the next. And so keep in mind, like, mood lability is not diagnostic, so that doesn't give you the diagnosis of bipolar disorder. Only an episode of mania or hypomania will.
Right. That's a component, you're saying, of a lot of different issues, that mental health issues that people may have.
Right. But people jump on that, right? Because it's pretty striking, right? Like, you're crying in somebody's office, all of a sudden the next second, you're cracking a joke and you're laughing. So people really are struck by that, of course, and then they'll give that diagnosis of bipolar disorder. That's not in the criteria. That happens with personality traits. That happens with anxiety. That happens with PTSD. That happens with lots of other disorders that are a lot more common than bipolar disorder.
So what are some of the warning signs that would indicate that a student might have bipolar disorder or be entering into an episode if they already had that diagnosis?
Yeah. So the number one thing is sleep. If they are sleeping very little, and I'm talking about 0 to 4 hours a night, and not feeling tired and looking like they're wide awake and energetic, and talking fast and thinking fast. And for those people who know them, they'll have a hard time keeping up. They'll have a hard time keeping up with their thoughts and not be able to replicate what was said in the conversation even understand, you know. And it's not like the bipolar person, the manic person is totally off. It just maybe they're operating at a much higher level, at broadband speed versus dial up like the rest of us. Like it's just too much for the rest of us. But that's a sign that something is going off here. And then I think, for people who like us, somebody walks in with really inappropriate clothing that doesn't fit their culture, that doesn't fit their style. They may be really religious, and they were never religious before, or they may have an excessive, Bibles or chains or all kinds of accoutrements essentially. That tells us something. That excess, I guess, being excessive, is a warning sign. I mean, there's a reason why that Las Vegas is a very popular destination for people in a manic state. Actually, Disneyland too. I've learned, in the college age population, I've had several students want to go to Disneyland because it kind of feels that your wish fulfillment, right? Like you want to be happy, you want to be carefree, you want to be in someplace exciting. Disneyland, Vegas, that shift in focus, is a warning sign.
You're listening to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss. Today we're hearing from our guest, Allyson Makuch, about her experience living with and managing bipolar disorder throughout her college and graduate school years. Also with us is University of California, Santa Cruz Director of Psychiatry, Dr. David Lowe, who's helping us learn more about bipolar disorder and ways to successfully manage it. Back to our interview. Allyson, can you tell us about what that experience was like for you, and when and how did you get diagnosed with bipolar 1 disorder? And what did those early years with the illness look like for you?
Yeah, so those early years they were pretty scary because I was quite young. I was 13 when I first started showing symptoms, and it took almost a year for me to get my diagnosis. And by that year mark, I lost 50 pounds. I was only 90 pounds and I'm 5'8". And I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating, and I started hallucinating and having delusions and filling journals with endless pages of writing. And so it was, at that point, I had been misdiagnosed as someone with anxiety, someone with a problem with stress. I was a type A student. I was just pushing myself too hard. But then eventually my primary care doctor saw us and asked if we had a history of bipolar in the family, which we do. And with the hallucinations, they finally gave me that bipolar 1 diagnosis. And I started that journey with medication, which really is, once you get that diagnosis, it's not like now you're treated and you're well. It really took many months of being way over sedated and falling asleep in class, to having kind of breakthrough episodes, to finally getting on the right mix of medications, along with some therapy from my psychiatrist and the right kind of exercise. And eventually I was able to get my weight back up and really, succeed. But that took a long time. And at first, not getting that diagnosis because I was so young and people thought maybe it's just kind of normal. So it's been a major part of my life since that young age.
So apparently you did get to college. So when you got to high school, you started to become more stabilized and was able to prepare to go to college.
Yeah. And I was pretty confident in myself at that point about what I needed. And so instead of, by the time I graduated high school with a 3.9 GPA, I knew that I wanted to go to a place that really suited my needs, my unique needs, rather than just going to a school that was going to give me the fanciest diploma. So I went to Sterling College, which at the time had only around 85 students. So extremely the smallest co-ed college in the country that had a work program. So I had meaningful work. I had physical work that I was doing, which is so good for, me and the folks that I know with bipolar disorder. And there was just regular meals every day. So it's a really unique experience that suited my health. So I didn't actually struggle with breakthrough manic episodes in college like a lot of students do. I had my highs and lows, but I was able to just manage it on one dose of medication.
It sounds like they provided a lot of structure that helped keep you well during that time. That is one of the, as I thought about this show, that is one of the areas that really stood out to me, that college students frequently are going from a home structured environment to college where they're having to take responsibility for a lot of new things. And so structure tends to disintegrate somewhat. And so it sounds like that was a good thing for you. I think you might be unusual in that you didn't have any major breakthroughs while you were an undergraduate student, coming in with that diagnosis because of all the reasons that I just mentioned. So I'm wondering if you could share what you were doing during that time to take care of your mental health, and how much attention did it require of you?
Yeah, so kind of like I mentioned, a lot of the effort of getting me to a mentally healthy place was coming from just the way that this program was structured. But also there was just such a strong, it's an environmental college. So, we were canoeing, I was woodworking, I was managing a woodlot, I was backpacking, all required courses. So there was that physicality that's there that I know, Dr. Lowe has always is pushing me to exercise more. Now I exercised a lot more in college, but there's something too about the fact that my classes were 10 students or less. Like the biggest class I ever took was 18 students. So the social network was so tight that if you didn't show up to class, everybody knew. And they were like, what's going on? Maybe they're sick. So if you missed 2 classes, people would know and start to worry. And so, at UCSC here, that is just not really the case. Or there's so many environments where that anonymity is just much more pronounced than what I experienced. And not feeling yourself as a thread in the communal web is not healthy. That connection and community is, I think, a core need. And so we try to build it, but it just can be structurally hard at these really huge schools to get everybody in the web, So that was kind of a difference.
So what kinds of things, besides for, like you said, being at a small school, did you personally take responsibility for in terms of managing that diagnosis?
Yeah, so I always saw my psychiatrist. I had therapy when I needed it. I led a meditation group every week when I could. I made sure to exercise. I always took my medication. So all those things were pretty core. And I also am an artist and a musician, and gave myself lots of opportunities to shine. And that was really nourishing for my spirit. And I played in a band that we played at the nursing home every Thursday. Some people would take out their earplugs or take out their hearing aids. They didn't like the banjo, but all those things together, yeah, and having just really, my friends are such a deep part of my life, and having those super close relationships where somebody who's willing to say to you and to have some discord and say, I think something's not right with you. I think you're not showing up in the way that you usually show up. Because so often people who are manic, they don't want to hear that. And they often don't believe you. They're like, this is me. You're rejecting me. So somebody who's brave enough to keep an eye on you. I always feel like safety is shared safety. So my friends can really help me bear that load of keeping me safe. So that was really important for me.
I understand that later, when you were in graduate school, you did have a major bipolar episode happen. And I'm wondering if you could describe what precipitated that event, and what happened, and what your recovery looked like after that.
Yeah, sure. So I, for about 7 years, was slowly decreasing my medication. And early on in my psychiatric treatment, the idea was, all right, we're catching this at 13, 14. you haven't had episodes in a decade. Maybe we can go off medication and see if you can manage. And then if you need to go back up, we'll go back up. So that was sort of the overall plan. What happened was we had strikes on campus, and all of a sudden we weren't going up on campus. And that sort of disrupted my routine a little bit. And I had been planning to go off the meds. And I found myself out in the sun all the time with a disrupted schedule. And I was like, oh, maybe I'll go off my meds now. And it was February, which is just all these things kind of loading in on each other that made it not a great time to actually go off the meds, but I did. And a couple months later, I found myself in Dr. Lowe's office having a full psychotic break. I was wearing like 5 coats, and I had 2 shopping bags full of books and journals that I needed to show him. And I then had a really difficult journey coming back from major hallucinations, major delusions, a lot of difficulty getting it back under control, because I've found that whereas before the episode, I was able to take a relatively low dose of medication, now I have to take a lot of medication. For me, historically, what I've taken, that combined with therapy, combined with going to some support groups and doing my RAP, the Wellness Recovery Action Plan. And so you can find some free PDFs online that you can fill out. And it just helps you. The biggest help that it's been for me has been just writing down all of my wellness tools, just write them all down, and then trying to at least hit one of them every day. And sometimes I can get a few. And so that has been really helpful for me, especially recently, now that I'm just working and I'm doing a peer counseling training program. So I'm really busy. So if I can, at the end of the night, do a little yoga, have some prayer, do some journaling, then I feel like, okay, I'm really taking these steps that over time, it seems like a little thing every day, but over time, those things can really make a difference. Recovery is a long game.
Yeah, I wanted to highlight that because when you and I spoke about coming on the show, you talked about how long it took you to come back from that episode you had in graduate school. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I would say so. After I had a few months of on and off hallucinating and having really difficult, very scary delusions, to then kind of sinking into the mania was done, but I was in a really deep depressive phase for over a year. And I could barely think, I could barely articulate myself. I thought my mind was I was in graduate school, I was in a PhD program where I, was supposed to be working at this high level mentally, and I felt like I could barely get through my day at the house. So that, I feel like, I don't know, this is just my pet theory, but I really felt like I had had a neurological trauma, and that it took me a long time to just legitimately rewire my brain for normal life. So yeah, it took me over a year, and I finally felt after almost 2 years that my confidence is back up, and I feel a little stronger. I feel a little more of like that internal locus of control, rather than feeling like I was just at the mercy of my body that was betraying me. So it took a really long time.
Allyson, can I ask you, was that the most severe manic episode you've ever experienced?
Yes, absolutely. You're actually the only psychiatrist who's ever seen a manic episode from me. The first time I had my major episodes when I was a kid, that was already kind of past, and the psychiatrist never really saw it. So it's really vulnerable also to be in that manic state. And so it was really, I was so grateful that I had such amazing psychiatric care at UCSC, and had that support of the Disability Resource Center, So I really was able to get through that with all the support that I needed.
Well, I think it says something about how well you took care of yourself, and maybe also how stressful the conditions were, and also the confluence of factors. I mean, so this is all pure speculation, but so you have genetic vulnerabilities to develop mania or depression, but you may have just done a really good job taking care of yourself, right environment, right social network is all kept at bay. And then boom, that confluence of factors happens,
Yeah,
in
COVID.
2020. Yeah, I mean, just,
It
you
was
know,
COVID.
yeah.
Yeah.
Plus
You,
COVID, yeah. A
yeah.
little stressor like that.
That's what happened. Yeah, remember when there were a bunch of reports like, oh, the crazies are getting crazier. The pandemic has started. And I was like, what? Oh, I think that I'm one of them.
Oh,
Yeah, because yeah, it happened right. Those episodes coincided right with the major shift
Mhm.
of now I'm just at home all the time and I have
Right.
oh, yeah, no structure.
again, pointing to how important that structure is, right? The social
Yeah,
network, the daily routines, all those things that you talked about. And Dr. Lowe, I wanted to just ask you, as you listen to Allison's story, from your experience of working with college students, what's typical and atypical in her story about getting diagnosed and about managing her bipolar diagnosis?
Well, let me share with you the atypical first. I mean, I think Allison's very intelligent, very insightful, and sounds like, if I met you as an undergrad, I would have been really struck by that she's very responsible, which is unlike our 18-year-olds, I mean, I often say it's insight and not medications that are your most important tool in treatment of bipolar disorder. I mean, of course, medications are important, but your ability to recognize something's going off within yourself, that you need help, that you need to do something different. That's what brings you to treatment, right?
Right. It's potent that Allison walked herself in a manic state.
Yeah,
That's mhm.
yeah. And she took care of herself all those undergraduate years, That's when people typically have their first and worst manic episode. You kept that at bay. You kept that at bay by doing a lot of things well, and really listening to yourself. I think that's really unusual for a young person.
The fact that perhaps she actually got diagnosed so early gave her a lot of lead time to sort of develop those um, habits and approaches before she actually did leave home. Many young people don't, if they come into college with the diagnosis, have just recently gotten it, or like you said, will get it in college. Dr. Lowe, could you just identify some of the risk factors for developing bipolar disorder?
Sure. So the number one risk is family genetics, and what's most important is in your immediate family. If you have a sibling, a parent with bipolar disorder, and it's not a given that you will have bipolar disorder. You can have a twin, you can have both parents bipolar disorder. It's still not a given that you have bipolar disorder. So it's not a foregone conclusion, but having those genetics really predisposes you to develop bipolar disorder. So that's one of our screening questions. When somebody comes in with depression, which is again a lot more common, we always ask about that. Anybody else in your family have any other disorders like bipolar disorder? There's not one gene that's identified with bipolar disorder. It's a cluster of genes. And as I was looking, I learned that diabetes, for instance, could be associated with rapid cycling bipolar disorder. But that was a small study. Maybe there are some neuroinflammatory problems that could lead to it. Certainly, a childhood abuse, maltreatment, they call it, which is, I think, a euphemistic word. Abuse is how I would like to describe it. And trauma certainly is linked with bipolar disorder, but causality has not been determined. I can understand that under stressful, traumatic situations and chronic conditions like that could push out the expression of bipolar genes, right? We understand that, like stress and trauma certainly push out the expression of bipolar genes. So yeah, the other thing I often stress to students who are diagnosed with bipolar disorder is that, yeah, okay, you have the genes, but let's try to keep your genes dormant as much as possible and not push out their expression. That's a cartoonish way of describing it, but it serves the purpose.
You're listening to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm Deborah Sloss, your host, and in today's interview, we're joined by two guests to discuss navigating bipolar disorder in college. Allyson Makuch is sharing with us the way she learned to manage bipolar disorder all through her college and graduate school years. Also with us is the University of California, Santa Cruz Director of Psychiatry, Dr. David Lowe, who's sharing information about risk factors, warning signs, and treatments for bipolar disorder. Every State of Mind episode has a resource list, and any we talk about today are included in the show notes for this episode. We've also now added episode transcriptions and access to listening and viewing with closed captions. Go to www.stateofmindmedia.org to access all that material and learn more on this topic. Now, let's get back to our interview. Dr. Lowe, I want to just come back to you, and can you talk a little bit about what the particular management challenges are of bipolar disorder for college students? What about college specifically makes it really challenging to manage?
Sure. Well, I think none of us like going to the doctors. None of us like to think we have something wrong with us, and that requires daily medication. So, so especially when you're 18, it is really hard to think that there is something wrong with you. And I think taking another step, I'm full of good news here. None of us want to think that we have something wrong with our brain. It's like, it's one thing if we have something wrong with our kidneys. Okay, that's bad enough. But then like, something wrong with our brain, our mind, our very selves, right? For understandable reasons, place huge emphasis on our mind, right, versus our other organs.
Particularly college students.
Yeah, I mean, like you don't want to think that. Yeah, I mean that you have a lifelong disorder you got to manage, and that there's something wrong with you. Of course, I don't agree with that statement that there's something wrong with you when you have bipolar disorder. But I understand why people would think that. We call it a disorder, so then it's really hard to accept and hard to manage without that acceptance, without that insight. And then once they get to treatment with me, I mean, I think we start with medications, of course. We want to get people stabilized, and we don't have great effective treatments without horrible side effects, essentially. I mean, side effects is the number one problem I have. I don't like making people really sedated. I don't like giving people weight gain. And there are worse side effects, neurological side effects. But all that is part of the risk. And, we'll take those risks in the early days because we need to get this person stabilized. But then long-term treatment is a problem. Who wants, to be sleepy all the time? Who wants weight gain? Who wants, tremors in their hands? Nobody, especially when you're 18. And they really don't want to take it. They don't want to take a pill every day already, like their grandparents. And now they have to deal with side effects in addition to all of that. That affects their image of themselves, body image and just, psychological self-image. Those are huge challenges to overcome. I don't, envy at all what a young person has to go through to accept this illness and work with. That's why, again, I think Allyson was especially impressive in her undergraduate years, dealing with all that, staying healthy.
I'm wondering, Allyson, as you listen to the risk factors and some of the triggers and warning signs that Dr. Lowe has been talking about, did any of those specifically relate to your experience when you had an episode as a college student?
All of them. Yeah, all of them. I'm like, oh yeah, the accoutrement. I had those. Yeah, definitely. I would also add that another kind of warning sign for me is disrupted eating patterns. So I might be still getting my sleep, but I just stop eating as much. And another thing too is that food just starts to taste bad. So things just start to feel like just they smell bad and taste bad, so you don't want to eat them. That was at least my experience, is that my eating just gets shifted, and I like all I could really eat when I was having those really wild manic episodes was like broth was the only thing that I wanted to actually ingest. But yeah, definitely sleep is my number one trigger, like you mentioned.
What do you do if you see any? I mean, do those warning signs still come up periodically at different times? And if so, what do you do? What's your, to an early warning system, so to speak? What's your response?
Yeah, I want to just take a step back here and say that this whole like managing the warning signs is just it's a constant everyday burden to be watchful of, well, how much am I sleeping? So for me, part of that has been like having a sleeping pill prescription so that and that took me a while. It took us a while to find one that actually works on me. Because once my kind of mania process has started, it takes a lot more to knock me out into sleep. So finding the right sleep medication so that I can intervene if I know I'm going to sleep in a hotel, which I can never sleep in a hotel. I'll bring that so that I'll just take it just to be safe rather than being on the back end of treating these things, trying to be proactive about what might happen. But that it takes a lot of energy to sort that out and to make sure that I'm eating somewhat regularly. And when, our lives, some of us, we don't have the 9 to 5 schedule where you come in and leave, especially grad school was very wide open. So yeah, trying to find that balance, yeah, takes a lot of effort for sure.
Earlier, Allison, you mentioned accessing accommodations through your college and through the Student Disability Center. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how using those services helped you navigate the demands of college while navigating bipolar disorder.
Yeah, I mean, plain and simple, I don't think that I'd have my master's degree without the accommodations that I got. And, having the backing of the DRC to protect me when it was just not possible for me to show up to class. And I was not capable of completing my work for a long time, but I got a year extension. I had extended time on my exam so I could take care of myself, and having that support so that I didn't have to push myself to my limit was, yeah, fundamental. And I also received a grant because after I had the episodes, then I had that really long depressed year. I eventually ended up, I was so suicidal that I checked myself into the hospital, and UCSC gave me a grant to cover that medical expense, my copay. So yeah, that support was awesome. So I was really grateful that UCSC had my back in that way.
Well, I'm really glad you bring that up because, many people do not understand that the disability centers are not only for learning disabilities, but also for mental health disabilities, that they have services and can help students navigate when they're dealing with a major mental health condition. So, David, is there anything you wish you had understood earlier in your own career when you're treating people with bipolar disorder?
I think that's a great question. I think when I was younger, I was less comfortable I guess, less comfortable in being myself. I mean, if somebody came in with bipolar, so I can remember when I was in training, I could be really stiff, and somebody could be very funny and very impulsive and provocative when they're manic. It doesn't mean that I need to match them with their humor. Not that I could, but me being really stiff and being real, dry and formulaic, that doesn't help. That doesn't help in me understanding what's happening and getting into their world and working with that. Same time, also, I think I'm a lot more confident now in speaking my worries really clearly and plain. Like, I'm worried that you're manic, that you're becoming bipolar. I mean, Allison, you could tell me, how that went, but like, as I think it doesn't help too if we're afraid. The clinician or the family member or the friend or the professor saying like, I'm worried about something going on. To just be like scared and afraid and not say anything, that doesn't help anybody, I don't think. I think hopefully I've done it in a respectful, clear way. Like, I'm worried about this happening and this is what I'm thinking here. So I tend to just spell out my thinking process. I'm not saying I'm right, I'm just spelling it out. And I take a lot more risk than that. And that's come with confidence and experience. Yeah, and hopefully I'm less stiff too. Like, I can go with some of the humor. Then, I'm obviously I need to have some boundaries for myself and not go everywhere, but yeah.
What about you, Allison? Is there anything you wish you had known earlier in your journey with navigating bipolar disorder?
Yeah, so I think the biggest lesson that I've learned, and part of this is going through those episodes, but also I think, I'm 30 now, and I've had this illness, I've been managing it for over 15 years, is that stability should be a measure of my success. Whereas previously I just was completely external in terms of how I measured my success. Was I getting 100%? Was I showing up? Was I participating? Was I reading all the material? And realizing that my stability was just like in the trash. And so now I recognize that if I'm going to have stability, maybe I am going to turn in that quiz a day late and get 10% off. Maybe that's okay. It's okay to get the 80% versus the 90% if it means I can sleep in. Dancing with it and having a different measure of success has been really healing for me.
While I'm speaking with you, Allison, are there specific resources that you would want to share that relate to bipolar disorders and that you think would be of value for college students?
Yeah, I would, especially for college students, but really for anyone, I would recommend going to a support group of some kind and just hearing the stories of recovery from other people with bipolar disorder. In particular, I go to support groups at the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance, the DBSA, and those have been really helpful. Also, there are some really great biographies and autobiographies of people with bipolar disorder. So just hearing their journeys, their successes, what they've left behind. An Unquiet Mind is kind of a seminal text for people with bipolar, and she specifically talks about getting on lithium, and that's by Kay Redfield Jamison.
So before we wrap up, I'm wondering if there are any closing thoughts that you would like to share with our listeners about navigating bipolar disorder for college students. Dr. Lowe?
Yeah, thanks again for this opportunity, and and thanks so much for sharing. It's very brave and vulnerable of you, Allison. But I think your message and your experience would go a long ways. I mean, I just want to reiterate insight. I think having awareness, into yourself, having awareness of what is happening, and having the courage and vulnerability to ask for help with that, understanding that, I think that is so key. And I really mean that. I think, obviously medications are a piece of the treatment, are an important piece of the treatment, but having insight is super important, and acceptance. And I mean, that goes to almost most aspects of our lives, right? And I think I just really want to also reiterate that there's still so much to understand and work on. In some ways, our treatments are very crude, and very simplistic, and have side effects, and we don't stress enough, psychotherapies. There's very specific psychotherapies out there now. I'm not aware of any specific for bipolar disorder, but there should be. We need to understand just even more, biologically and genetically too. What if we had ways of turning off genes, and helping them stay dormant? Like, we talked earlier about the whole kindling theory, and maybe untreated bipolar disorder gets worse. These are all theories. I think there's evidence, but we still have so much we don't understand. Mostly what we've talked about today, none of it is hard and fast. We still need to spend a lot more time with this. So, and I'm optimistic that we will continue to advance, in glacial ways, but we will continue to advance and help people with bipolar disorder live their lives essentially.
Allison, any last thoughts that you want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, three things. I just want to emphasize what Dr. Lowe said about insight. There's no pill that you can take that's as valuable in some cases as having the right insight at the right time. It's just so important. Another thing is that students often find themselves in a position where they have to disclose the fact that they have bipolar disorder to somebody. And I just want to say that, the first 10 seconds is the worst part. And then it gets better, because then there can be a dialogue. But if you need to disclose to teachers, maybe you do it with the help of a letter from the DRC or from your psychiatrist, but having people on your side who can help you get the support you need is really the only way that I found to make it work to get through school. And then the last thing I'd say is that I think there's something in bipolar that while there can be that mood instability, I think there also can be that compensating mechanism to really narrow the emotional experience, where you say, oh, well, if I'm really up and excited, maybe I'm a little manic. And then I'm down, oh no, what if I'm in depression? So how do I recognize when I'm having a normal flow of highs and lows versus something to be more concerned about? And like accepting an emotional, like a rich emotional experience in life without feeling that fear is kind of a journey, but it's possible. I cry more now than I ever did, and it's good.
To wrap up our interview today, Allyson, who's not only an articulate and insightful woman, is also a musician, and she's graciously shared with us this song she wrote and performed about her experience of living with bipolar disorder.
Sweet July, come and find me. I've been on the lam. Dark water flows behind me, and I think I'll understand you, sweet July. Sweet July. It tastes like fire in my memory of it, losing my own mind in a dreamland, in a nightmare world. You can't even trust your eyes. You can't even trust your eyes, sweet July. Sweet July, hold tight to me. Am I alive? Am I on the rails? Broken pieces scatter, clasp your hands in a silent prayer. In silence. Pull the ivy from my window, Anna, let it in. You've got a new baby, a new morning coming, a new moon to dance within. Who are you then, girl, with your face done up and a black hole in your heart? I guess I still needed that nighttime fever and the whole world to rip apart. Oh, sweet July, come and find me. I've been on the lam. Dark water flows behind me, and I think I'll understand you. I think I'll understand you, sweet July. Sweet July. Sweet July.
You've been listening to State of Mind, being human and living well.
And living well.
And living well.
Living well.
And living well.
I want to say a huge thank you to our guests today, Allyson Makuch and Dr. David Lowe, and thanks to you for joining us. If you found today's show interesting, you may also want to check out episode 42 and 43 on building resilience and episode 40 on trauma in the central nervous system. New episodes of State of Mind exploring mental health and wellness are released the first Sunday of every month and can be found along with our complete archive on our website at www.stateofmindmedia.org. If you missed part of this episode or you just want to hear it again, subscribe to our podcast on all the major podcast platforms. Also, when you rate and review our podcast, you really do help it get found and heard by more listeners. So if you like this or any of our episodes, could you please do that for us? Special thanks to Youssef Hassanain for audio production, Patrice Vecchione for In Your Voice story coaching, Patty Palmer for transcriptions, Rebecca Levy for media outreach, and Katrina Tattenham for advanced research. And thanks to acoustic guitarist Adrian Legg for composing, performing, and donating the use of our theme music. State of Mind was developed and originally broadcast in association with KSQD-FM in Santa Cruz, California. We always want to hear from listeners and community members just like you. You can submit your very own In Your Voice recording and become part of the conversation by either calling in to leave a message or recording an audio file right on your phone. Either way, tell us about a mental health experience you've had, something that's contributed to your mental health recovery, or share a resource that's been helpful for you. We really do want to hear from you, and your voice may just be on one of our future shows. Submission details can be found at www.stateofmindmedia.org. Come on back and join us again next month for a whole new episode of State of Mind. Until then, live well.